Ma'am, is this the person you called about? The officer asked Karen. Yes, officer. I didn't know who he was. He looked suspicious. You ever have one of those days where you're just minding your business, doing something completely normal, and then out of nowhere, boom, some nonsense happens? That was me on what was supposed to be a quiet Saturday morning. I was out in my front yard, mowing the lawn like I always do. Nothing unusual. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the smell of freshly cut grass filled the air. It was just another weekend, another chore to check off my list. But apparently, for one of my neighbors, me maintaining my own yard was suspicious enough to call the police. Now, I've lived in this neighborhood for a few years. It's mostly quiet, family friendly, nothing too crazy, but there's always that one person. And in my case, it was the woman who lived two houses down. She was your typical Karen, middle aged, always watching, always ready to report something she didn't like. And for some reason, she really didn't like me. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. I had my headphones in, pushing my mower back and forth across the yard, lost in my own world. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her standing on her porch, phone in hand. I figured she was just being nosy, something I'd gotten used to. I didn't think much of it. That is, until I saw a police car slowly rolling down my street. I turned off my mower, pulled out my earbuds, and just stood there, watching as the officer stepped out of his cruiser and started walking toward me. My stomach tightened. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but that doesn't always mean much when you're a black man and the cops get involved. Sir, can you step away from the lawnmower? The officer asked, his tone neutral but firm. I blinked. Excuse me? Before I continue, I'm on a road to 1,000 subscribers as a small channel. If you want to help me reach my goal, please watch the video until the end and subscribe if you like this type of content. I would really appreciate it. Now let's continue. I blinked. Excuse me? I glanced over at Karen, who was standing on her porch with her arms crossed, watching everything unfold like she was proud of herself. That's when it hit me. She had actually called the cops. On me. For mowing my own damn lawn. But what happened next? That was something nobody saw coming. Now let me tell you a little bit about Karen. Of course, that's not her real name, but you know the type. Middle-aged, always peering out from behind her curtains, always ready to insert herself into things that don't concern her. She had lived in the neighborhood longer than I had, and from the moment I moved in, she made it clear she wasn't exactly thrilled about my presence. At first, I brushed it off. Some people just aren't friendly, no big deal. But over time, it became obvious. Karen wasn't just unfriendly. She had a problem with me. It started small, side-eyeing me when I walked my dog, whispering to neighbors when I passed by, asking unnecessary questions like, "Oh, you live here?" As if a black man owning a home on this street was just so surprising. Then there were the complaints. One time she knocked on my door to tell me my trash cans were 2 inches too close to the curb. Another time she left a note on my car about how my grass was getting too long, as if she was the HOA president, which she most definitely was not. But this? Calling the cops on me for mowing my own lawn? That was a new low, even for her. Now, I wasn't completely naive. I knew there were people like her in the world. People who saw a black man and immediately assumed the worst. People who thought we didn't belong in their neighborhoods. But this was something else. She wasn't just annoyed that I lived here. She was actively looking for ways to make my life harder. And the worst part? I had a feeling this wasn't the first time she'd done something like this. After all, why else would she be so comfortable picking up the phone and calling 911 over a man mowing his own grass? As I stood there facing the officer who had just asked me to step away from my lawnmower, I could see Karen watching intently, arms crossed, lips pressed into a smug little smirk. She wanted this. She wanted me to be humiliated. But she had no idea that this time, things weren't going to go the way she expected. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm as I looked at the officer standing in front of me. I knew how these situations could go. I'd seen enough stories, hell, I'd lived enough moments, to understand that one wrong move, One wrong word could turn something ridiculous into something dangerous. Sir, we received a report about a suspicious person on this property, the officer said, his voice measured. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. A suspicious person? You mean me mowing my own lawn? The officer's face didn't change. Do you live here? I clenched my jaw. I shouldn't have to prove that I own my own damn home. But I knew better than to get worked up. This wasn't the first time I'd been questioned for simply existing in my own space. Yeah, I live here, I said, keeping my voice even. I've lived here for years. I reached into my pocket to pull out my wallet, moving slow and deliberate, because again, I knew how things could go. The officer watched as I pulled out my ID and handed it to him. He glanced at it, then at the house, then back at me. I could see the shift in his posture. He knew this was nonsense. But instead of immediately wrapping things up, he turned his head and looked over at Karen, who was still standing on her porch, arms crossed like she had just caught me in the act of doing something illegal. Ma'am, is this the person you called about? The officer asked, raising his voice so she could hear. Karen stepped forward, lifting her chin. Yes, officer, I didn't know who he was. He looked suspicious. Suspicious. That word hung in the air like a bad smell. I had lived here for years, and she knew damn well who I was. She had seen me every single day, leaving for work, coming home, jogging in the mornings, getting my mail. But suddenly, today, I was suspicious? The officer turned back to me, and for a split second, I saw something in his expression. Maybe embarrassment, maybe irritation. Whatever it was, I knew he realized this was a waste of time. Sir, he said, handing me back my ID. I apologize for the misunderstanding. There's clearly no issue here. I exhaled, feeling the tension in my shoulders loosen just a little. But Karen wasn't done. She let out an exaggerated scoff and shook her head. Well, how was I supposed to know? We've had break-ins around here. I was just trying to be safe. That was a lie. There hadn't been a single break-in in this neighborhood in years. And if she was so worried about crime, why hadn't she called the cops on the actual strangers who came through? Like the landscaping crews, the delivery drivers, the teenagers riding their bikes from another block over? Number. It was me. Because in her mind, I didn't belong. The officer turned to Karen and his expression shifted. Less patience now, more authority. Ma'am, do you have any actual reason to believe this man doesn't live here? Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. She faltered, suddenly realizing that things weren't going her way. I crossed my arms and watched as she scrambled for something to say. For once, she didn't have an answer. But what happened next? That was the real surprise. I stood there, gripping my lawnmower handle, watching the officer shift uncomfortably. He knew this was ridiculous, but there was a protocol to follow. Sir, do you mind if I just confirm your address in our system? He asked. I sighed. Go ahead. He stepped aside, radioing in to confirm what should have already been obvious. I was standing in front of my own house. Meanwhile, Karen still hovered nearby, arms crossed, her mouth twitching like she had something else to say. And I knew she did. Because Karen didn't just make mistakes. She doubled down on them. Before the officer could finish on his radio, she threw her hands up dramatically. You see what I mean, officer? He's getting aggressive now. I turned my head so fast I almost gave myself whiplash. Aggressive, I repeated. Are you serious? Karen pointed at me like she had just uncovered some terrible crime. You're raising your voice. Now I wasn't about to let her twist the situation. I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and kept my tone even. I'm not raising my voice. I'm frustrated because you called the cops on me for no reason. The officer frowned and turned to her. Ma'am, what exactly did you tell 911? Karen folded her arms tighter. I said there was a suspicious man outside. He was walking back and forth with some kind of equipment, and The officer raised a hand, cutting her off. Ma'am, we have the actual recording of your call. Let me hear it for myself. He tapped his radio requesting the dispatch playback. A few moments later, his radio crackled to life with the 911 call that started this mess. 911, what's your emergency? Yes, hi, I need an officer to come to my neighborhood right away. There's a strange man outside and I don't know what he's doing. Can you describe him? He's black, wearing a t-shirt and jeans, and he's pushing some kind of machine back and forth in front of a house. Ma'am, do you believe he is committing a crime? I don't know, but he doesn't look like he belongs here. Please just send someone quickly before something happens. The recording ended. Silence. Even the officer's face had changed, his professional mask slipping just a little to show what I was pretty sure was disbelief. He turned to Karen, one brow raised. Ma'am, you called 911? Because a man was mowing his lawn? Karen flinched. Well, I thought... The officer sighed. Do you know that making a false emergency call is a crime? That's when I saw it. Karen's face paled. False? She sputtered. I was just trying to be cautious. It's not my fault he looks like he doesn't belong. And there it was. She finally said it out loud. The officer glanced at me, his jaw tightening, then turned back to her. Ma'am, I need you to step over here. Karen's eyes widened. Wait, what? Why? Because I have more questions for you, the officer said, his voice firm now. And if I find out this was racially motivated, you could be looking at consequences. I almost laughed. Not because this was funny, but because for once Karen wasn't getting away with it. And what happened next? Even I wasn't expecting that. Karen's smug expression was gone. She stood there, her face a mix of confusion and panic. Wait, she stammered, holding her hands up. I was just trying to be a good neighbor. The officer didn't look convinced. A good neighbor? He shook his head. Ma'am, you called 911, exaggerated the situation, and falsely claimed this man was acting suspiciously when he was clearly just mowing his lawn. I crossed my arms and tilted my head, watching her squirm. So, officer, what happens now? Karen's eyes darted between us. Now wait a minute. I should be the one asking questions. What if he wasn't supposed to be here? What if something had been going on? Then you'd be thanking me. The officer ignored her, pressing his radio again. Dispatch, can you check for any prior calls made from this address in the last 2 years? Karen's mouth snapped shut. Oh, now she was nervous. A moment later, the radio crackled back. Copy that. Checking records now. The officer folded his arms. Because, ma'am, if you've made multiple calls like this before, especially about the same person, you could be looking at charges for filing false reports. Karen started shaking her head furiously. Oh, come on, this is ridiculous. I've never done anything like this before. But the radio told a different story. Dispatch to Officer Reynolds. We have multiple reports filed from that address, all similar in nature. 3 separate calls in the past year about a suspicious black male in the neighborhood. Each time, the subject was found to be the homeowner. I let out a sharp breath. 3 times. 3 separate times she had done this. And now she had nowhere to hide. The officer turned back to Karen, his expression unreadable. So, this isn't the first time you've called the police on this man for simply existing in his own neighborhood? Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since this all started, she looked truly afraid. I took a step closer, looking her dead in the eye. So, Karen, is this what you do for fun? Waste the cops' time? Harass your neighbors? She flinched, her face burning red. I was just being careful. The officer sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose like he had a headache. Ma'am, you do understand that this is harassment, right? That every time you've called the police on this man for no reason, you've put him in danger? Karen looked at me then, and for a second, I thought I saw something close to regret flash across her face. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by stubborn defiance. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I shook my head, laughing bitterly. Number you meant for exactly this to happen. You just didn't expect to get called out for it. The officer pulled out his notepad. Sir, he said, turning to me, would you like to file a report for harassment? That caught Karen off guard. Wait, what? I hesitated, taking a deep breath. Did I want to go through all that trouble? But then I thought about all the other black men and women who had been put in danger because of calls like this. Calls that had gone very differently. Calls that had ended in handcuffs or worse. And I thought about the fact that if this situation had played out just a little differently, if a different cop had shown up, or if I'd reacted the wrong way, I might not be standing here having this conversation at all. I turned back to the officer. Yes, I said firmly. I'd like to file a report. Karen gasped. Oh, come on, this is ridiculous. I was just... The officer cut her off. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me. Karen's eyes widened. Wait, what? You're arresting me? The officer gave her a long look. You wasted emergency resources, made repeated false reports, and harassed your neighbor. At the very least, you're being detained for questioning. And just like that, the tables had turned. Karen's face crumpled. This isn't fair, she whined as the officer led her toward his car. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, vindication, exhaustion. This time Karen's lies had caught up with her. But the bigger issue? This wasn't just about her. It was about a system that allowed people like her to weaponize 911 against people like me. And I had a lot more to say about that. As Karen was led to the police car, she kept sputtering, throwing out excuses like a kid caught cheating on a test. I didn't mean to waste police time, she whined. I was just looking out for my neighborhood. The officer wasn't having it. Ma'am, you've filed 3 separate false reports in the last year alone. That's not looking out, that's harassment. I crossed my arms, watching the whole scene unfold. For the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, someone was actually holding people like her accountable. Karen stopped struggling and turned to look at me, her eyes filled with something that almost looked like pleading. You don't have to do this, she said, her voice lower now. We're neighbors. Can't we just forget this happened? I let out a humorless chuckle. Forget this happened? I repeated. Karen, you could have gotten me killed. She flinched, but I wasn't done. You called the cops on me for existing? Multiple times. And you knew what you were doing, I said, shaking my head. I don't know if you thought it was just a game or if you actually believed I was a threat, but either way, you're learning today that actions have consequences. The officer nodded in agreement. And unfortunately, ma'am, those consequences include a possible charge for misuse of emergency services. Karen paled. A charge? You're going to ruin my life over a misunderstanding? I raised an eyebrow. Ruin your life? I took a step closer, my voice steady but firm. Karen, I'm lucky. Lucky this officer actually listened. Lucky he didn't show up with his hand on his gun, assuming the worst. Lucky I wasn't on the ground in handcuffs before I even got a chance to explain myself. She swallowed hard, looking away. But not everyone gets that lucky, I continued. You ever think about that when you pick up the phone? Silence. I turned to the officer. What happens now? Well, he said, at the very least she's looking at a fine. But given her history, I'd say the department might consider more serious consequences. Karen let out a small, panicked gasp. A fine? But The officer cut her off. That's not up to me, ma'am. We'll let the department handle it. With that, he motioned for her to get in the car. She hesitated but eventually slid into the back seat, her face red with anger, embarrassment, or both. I watched as the cruiser pulled away, letting out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. It was over. But the conversation wasn't, because this wasn't just about me and Karen. This was about a pattern, one that happened all the time to people like me in neighborhoods like this. And I wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. As I stood there watching the police car disappear down the street, a mix of emotions ran through me. Relief, sure. Vindication? A little, but mostly I felt tired. Because the truth is, this wasn't just about Karen. This was about a system that lets people like her weaponize the police against black folks just trying to live their lives. And it's not new, it's been happening forever. How many times have we seen this story? A black kid selling lemonade gets the cops called on him. A black woman sitting in a Starbucks waiting for a friend gets arrested. A black family having a barbecue in a public park gets harassed because they don't belong. And every time the people making these calls act shocked when they're confronted, like Karen did today. They hide behind phrases like, "I was just being cautious," or "I didn't mean any harm." But the harm is real, the danger is real. I got lucky today. The officer who showed up actually listened, but what if he hadn't? What if he had come in with his hand on his gun, already convinced I was a threat? That's the problem. People like Karen don't think about the consequences when they pick up that phone. They don't think about the very real danger they're putting people like me in. They don't think about the lives that have been lost because of calls like these. And they should. I knew right then that I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't just going to be another black man who had to laugh it off or be the bigger person. No, I was going to talk about it, share my story, let people know that this is happening every single day in places just like this to people just like me. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us speak up the next time someone like Karen gets the urge to pick up the phone, they'll think twice. Later that evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cooler now, the neighborhood quiet again, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Word had already started spreading about what went down. A couple of my neighbors had stopped by, awkwardly trying to act like they hadn't heard anything. Some offered half-hearted apologies. I never thought Karen would go that far, while others just avoided eye contact altogether. And Karen? Well, she wasn't back yet. Maybe she was still at the station, answering questions. Maybe she was at home, too embarrassed to step outside. Either way, for the first time, she was the one feeling uncomfortable. Good. Because if I had to feel that way in my own neighborhood, if I had to constantly prove that I belonged, then she could sit with that feeling for a while too. But more than anything, I hoped she learned something. And I hoped this story would make other people like her think twice before using the police as their personal complaint line. Because today, Karen's plan backfired. And next time? Maybe there won't be a next time.